Resuming debate, the Honourable Minister for Women and Gender Equality.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a great privilege to rise on this traditional territory that the Algonquin peoples have called home for generations upon generations to speak on Bill C-97, Budget 2019 Implementation Act, and specifically about the amendments our government is putting forward for the National Housing Strategy Act. We are enshrining into law the right to housing as a human right and requiring every future federal government to develop and maintain a national housing strategy and to be accountable to Canadians. Our government's investing in housing is already at unprecedented levels, but that's not the only reason why the National Housing Strategy Act represents such a historic step in giving more Canadians a place to call home. What makes the National Housing Strategy Act truly transformational for Canadians is that it recognizes the human rights-based approach to housing that underlies the National Housing Strategy and enshrines it into law. During the committee stage of Bill C-97, our government put forward significant amendments to recognize that the right to adequate housing is a fundamental human right affirmed in international law. We recognize that housing is critical not just to the well-being of all Canadians, but to building sustainable, inclusive communities. We've ensured that Canada's first ever national housing strategy isn't also the last by requiring that every future federal government develop and maintain a national housing strategy that takes into account the key principle of housing as a human right. Today is a historic day for housing in Canada because we're introducing amendments to the National Housing Strategy Act that will further entrench and protect the commitments we've already made. These amendments will ensure greater accountability, and they will give vulnerable Canadians a greater voice in housing decisions that affect them. The National Housing Strategy Act also calls for the creation of a federal housing advocate, supported by the Canadian Human Rights Commission. Thanks to today's amendments, we are enhancing the advocate's role in identifying and researching systemic housing challenges. The federal housing advocate will be able to consult with vulnerable Canadians, people with lived experience, experts, to better understand the impact of housing need and homelessness. The advocate will report to the minister responsible for housing on these issues. Its recommendations will be tabled here in Parliament, and the minister and the government will be required to respond. The National Housing Strategy Act will create a National Housing Council supported by CMHC, which will act as a focal point for housing policy discussions on the National Housing Strategy and will advise the minister on how to improve housing outcomes. With today's amendments, we're empowering the National Housing Council with even more freedom to support the federal housing advocate and to report on their findings to the minister responsible. Today's amendments detail how the minister and the government will be required to report back to the House and to Canadians on the recommendations they receive. Simply stating that housing is a human right means nothing unless there are robust accountability mechanisms, reporting mechanisms in place, and with these amendments, we are doing precisely that. These changes, to say nothing of the National Housing Strategy itself, came about as a result of cross-Canada consultations with thousands of people from all walks of life. Their stories, their experiences, and their challenges provided us, along with their expertise, fuller understanding of the state of housing in Canada today. While I'm proud to say that our investments have made a significant impact on giving more Canadians a place to call home, I recognize, and we recognize, that there is much more work to do. It's thanks to the communities of stakeholders, people with lived experience, those in housing need, and experts that we are able to take the historic steps that we're taking today. I have to take this opportunity to thank my constituents in Peterborough-Kawartha for their contributions to the housing strategy development process, to the minister responsible for this file, and of course, the member from Spadina-Fort York, who is forever a champion for safe, affordable housing in Canada. Today's amendments fulfill one of Canada's key international commitments. We are a signatory to the UN International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and as such, we have a responsibility to meet one of the Covenant's core commitments, to progressively realize the right to adequate housing as part of an adequate standard of living for our citizens. Never before has a rights-based approach to housing has been part of housing policy in this country. These are major milestones that will improve the lives of Canadians now and for generations to come. Mr. Speaker, personally speaking, when my family first moved to Peterborough, we didn't have a place to call home. We lived in a shelter provided by the YWCA. We benefited from social housing soon after. It was having that access to safe, secure housing that allowed my family and I to put our lives back together and to feel like we have a place that we can call home, a community in which we belong. On behalf of my family and so many millions of Canadians who've been transformed by access to housing services and housing workers in this country, I'd like to say thank you to those who've come before us, to those who've contributed to the National Housing Strategy and the National Housing Strategy Act, to the team that has developed this really smart approach to lifting Canadians out of poverty and creating a stronger middle class, and of course to every single member of this House who's going to rise in support of this transformational bill. Merci.